Hello and welcome to the third part of the Art of Argumentation PowerPoint, which features how to identify and assess the use of appeals in an argument. Now that we've built on a solid foundation of the structure of an argument, being able to tell the main conclusion, the intermediates, use of evidence, examples, or premises, as well as whether an argument is deductive or inductive, one of the other things you can look for other than assumptions is appeals. Now, unlike assumptions though, appeals can either be strong or weak, so I want to explain that. First of all, appeals are a rhetorical strategy meant to target an audience's emotion. You may have encountered appeals before in 10th grade English when you were looking at speeches and you were looking to see what kind of appeals to the audience the speaker used. Probably most often appeal to fear or appeal to values, or often also appeal to pity. But in English class, you look to see if that appeal really moved the audience, and in that case worked well as a rhetorical device to move their point across. In global, you have to think differently. It's not about how it impacts the reader. It honestly does not matter. It's whether or not the support in the argument makes a case for the appeal being used in a way that's justifiable. Or if not, if they're just using the appeal rather than any kind of support, then the stylistic choice shows that the speaker does not have much concrete support for what they have to say, and instead is relying over style versus substance. So just be careful. I don't want to see in your responses you even mentioning, oh, this impacts the reader by making them feel bad, or this makes the reader feel scared. That's not how we use appeals in global perspective. So I wanted to start with that. So as I began, appeals can be a strength or weakness depending on whether or not it's warranted. And that's the word in bold, and that's the technical word I want you to think about. If the situation is so severe, it's so dire, that it makes sense to use appeal to pity, appeal to values, appeal to fear, then the appeal can be used as a strength. This is especially the case if the author then presents alarming statistics, an alarming number of people who are affected by whatever the topic is. So for example, right now when we're talking about the coronavirus pandemic and we're talking about hotspots and thousands of people getting sick and dying, then of course it makes sense to use appeal to fear or appeal to pity. Or we're talking about the refugee crisis and millions of people being displaced, it makes sense to use appeal to pity. If, on the other hand, the appeal is irrelevant because there's really not a lot of support for it, in fact, it seems exaggerated, and I can tell that the author is really just trying to manipulate the reader, manipulate the audience, then an appeal is a weakness. So you'll notice now how global starts to get a little more difficult because you really have to assess with common sense and strong analytical skills whether something is a strength or a weakness. So let's go through the different appeals, all of these which can be strengths or weaknesses. So first of all, appeal to authority. I'm claiming support for my conclusion because an expert agrees with me, because the president agrees with me, because a famous celebrity agrees with me. So in my example, you must read this book because it's on Oprah's book club. Notice when I think of the substance of the argument, what makes the book good? Does it have a fast-paced plot? Does it have interesting characterizations, great use of language? That's what I want to know about when it comes to choosing a book, not that someone endorses it. We need experts. Experts can add strength to my argument, but I need experts to say something of concrete value because they conducted a poll, because they've interviewed people who go through this, because they've done a study, not just because they endorse it. Then you have appeal to popularity. This is also often referred to as bandwagon effect because basically you're saying everybody has this latest iPhone, everyone has this latest technological device, then you should as well. Or everyone's supporting this bill, you should too. So for instance, this bill must be passed since most Americans want it. If they gave me a survey that sampled 1,000 Americans and showed that 70% approve, this appeal would be a strength. As it stands now, it's weak though. Then you have appeal to tradition, in which I'm saying we must support something because it's been done, over and over again. So think of traditional American stances on things. So for example, prayer in school is a traditional part of a child's education. Notice how vague that argument is. As it stands there, it's not a very strong use of the appeal. Then you have appeal to history, which is similar to tradition, but tradition tends to be vague. Tradition would be something like, oh, we must stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Because we've always done that. As opposed to appeal to history, where I would go back to the original songwriter of those lyrics and how important it was for him as he witnessed that battle. So we should do the same thing. Or, for example, Thomas Jefferson believed in a small central government, so we should cut back on the federal government's role in local rule. So history is more specific. I'm going to mention an event or an individual rather than tradition, which is more general. And then you have the opposite of these two, which is appeal to novelty. Novelty means it's new. And that could be a good thing, but simply because it's new does not mean it's a strength. So if I say this new product will change education for the better, and I don't explain how, and I don't explain any studies that were done to show what % increase it has on students' understanding, then that's a weak use of the appeal. If, in contrast, I can show, oh, a study was done with 5,000 participants and they showed a 10% increase in reading comprehension, then your appeal is used in a warranted fashion. Next, you have the appeals you're probably most familiar with, appeal to fear, also known as scare tactics. You want to incite a sense of fear in your reader. Americans will see their rights completely removed unless we stop authoritarian inclinations now. I want them afraid of the consequences of something, but it needs to have support to be warranted. Then you have appeal to pity, which is similar, but I don't want to scare you, I want to make you feel bad. So for instance, children will fall behind unless we support early education now. If we can give proof of that, that could be well used. And then you have appeal to values, which appeals to the audience's sense of morality, sense of right or wrong. So sometimes students have trouble telling this apart from pity. But basically, I'm inciting you, I'm inspiring you to do the right thing. I don't want to make you feel bad, I want to make you feel moved. So we think of the coronavirus pandemic and we're told to follow certain guidelines. And one of the appeals that's being used is values. It's the right thing to do for our community to keep everybody safe, to follow these guidelines. So that can be warranted if there's support. Oh, yes, various studies have come out to say that wearing masks does reduce the risk of spreading the virus. So then the appeal could be warranted. If it's exaggerated, it's unwarranted and therefore a flaw. Overall, just be careful. Sometimes I'll read an argument and I agree with it. I agree with the conclusion they come to. I like the use of the appeals on an emotional level, but I have to put that aside. That does not make an argument strong just because I agree with where it lies, where it stands. I have to look at the support, the evidence, the examples, the premises. Are those strong? And that's where I have to overall evaluate an argument. So let's look at some examples you might see in a university campus. We have two students arguing about Stalin's reign in the Soviet Union. Dave has been arguing that Stalin was a great leader, while his friend disagrees, obviously, because he was a terrible leader who killed millions of people. And he explains that. And Dave says, however, I have a book at home that says Stalin was acting in the best interest of the people. The millions that were killed were vicious enemies of the state, and they had to be killed to protect the rest of the peaceful citizens. Terrible argument, but notice what he's resting a lot of it in, which is, I have a book at home. We don't know the author. We don't know the reliability. It's just this book. So what appeal is that? That's appeal to authority. And you can see how weak it can be if there's not a lot of support given. Then we have this one. You shouldn't say such things against multiculturalism. If the chair heard what you were saying, you would never receive tenure. So you had better learn to accept that it is simply wrong to speak out against it. The key there is you would never receive tenure. And there's no real reason given for why we can't say these things. It's just wrong. So there's no real room for debate here. But since the fear is incited and you would never receive tenure, this is an appeal to fear. Then we have, sure, I believe in God. People have believed in God for thousands of years, so it seems clear that God must exist. After all, why else would the belief last so long? That one's pretty easy. It's This belief has lasted for thousands of years, so that's appeal to tradition. As it stands, it's weak, but if you found anthropological studies that compared different cultures and looked at commonalities in their belief system, this could be a valid use of an appeal. Jill says he'd be a terrible coach for the team. Bill argues he has his heart set on the job, it would break his heart if he didn't, and convinces Jill as a result. So we're trying to pull heartstrings here, so this is use of appeal to pity. In our next example, it's pretty easy. The stress here is everyone is selfish. Everyone is doing what he believes will make himself happier. Why should you feel guilty for seeking your own happiness when that's what everyone else is doing too? Okay, everyone. Clearly the appeal here is appeal to popularity. If there was a statistic, a survey to back this up, it could make this a lot stronger. As it stands here, it is unwarranted. Okay, so I'm not going to read this whole thing because it's quite lengthy, but basically a professor's saying that new ideas are much better, that the ideas from the past, from old thinkers, might have had some valid points back then, but they're just as outdated as dinosaurs. And the student is saying, so would you say that new moralities are better because they are newer? And the professor says, exactly, newer is better. So the emphasis on new here means that this is appeal to novelty. So how do we see this on a paper? So the examples I've been showing you are really easy things that don't require too much of my analytical abilities. Well, here's the paper one, Meat Free Future, that we've been working on before, and this one has several appeals. So I thought it would be a good way to branch off now from structure to talk about the use of appeals. If you go back to that first body paragraph, the author says ancient Egyptians were vegetarian. So which appeal is this? If the ancient Egyptians did it, I should do it too. Notice it's general, it's not very specific. So this means it's appeal to tradition. Look at the second body paragraph. Even the most committed meat eaters would agree that we should not eat intelligent life forms. If something has a developed brain and it has a complex system of thought, how could we eat it? Notice it's not necessarily wanting to make me feel bad, it's not scaring me, but it's saying it's not right to do it. So what appeal is that? Appeal to values. And in the third body paragraph, it gets a little more intense. He's talking about, it is strange that none of the meat apologists ever volunteered to be kept in a pen all their life, to be stunned by a large electrical current and then killed as soon as they reach adulthood. Notice the language gets more loaded, it's more vivid in its descriptions. It wants me to feel terrible that I would eat something that had to endure all of that. So that's appeal to pity. So then what you ask yourself is, are those used in a warranted way? The first one is not, because the support is weak, one tissue from one mummy, as we've discussed before. The second one may be a little more warranted. It is true that some of these animals are highly intelligent. So is it then wrong to eat them? I think it brings up a valid argument in that case. And then the last one could be warranted. It could be a strength if some examples were provided of animal conditions and just how terribly they're treated, but the author doesn't do that. So in that case, it's unjustified. It seems potentially exaggerated, so it's weak. So of the three here, only the second one seems to work. And that's how your brain needs to calculate, not just being able to tell what kind of appeals are used, but whether or not those appeals are used to strengthen the argument, or if, on the other hand, they're a flaw and they weaken the argument. Right, so just one more thing in that arsenal we're building to be able to astutely assess the strengths and weaknesses of an argument. Thanks again.